How violent does a movie have to be before governments, critics, and terrified parents try to bury it forever? In the 1980s, some sci-fi films pushed so far beyond the limits that theaters cut them apart, countries banned them, and VHS stores hid them behind counters like contraband. But decades later, these same movies are now called masterpieces. Tonight, we are diving into 15 sci-fi films once considered too dangerous for the public, and one of them still feels disturbing enough to trigger controversy today. Altered States, 1980.
Deneyi rahatsız edici bulmuştu. Bazı denekler keyif verici, birkaç öğrenci de halüsinatif bulmuştu.
This is not a movie about science going wrong. It is a movie about a man trying to break open reality itself. Altered States arrived in 1980 with a premise that sounded almost too strange for mainstream audiences. A respected scientist uses sensory deprivation tanks and powerful hallucinogenic experiments to explore the deepest layers of human consciousness. But what begins as intellectual curiosity slowly turns into something frightening, physical, and almost prehistoric. The film mixes laboratory science, religious imagery, psychological terror, and body transformation in a way that made it feel dangerous for its time. This was not clean spaceship science fiction. It was sweaty, unstable, and almost feverish, as if the human mind had become a haunted house. Its disturbing visions, naked vulnerability, and intense transformation scenes made it feel far more extreme than a normal studio sci-fi film. For audiences expecting simple future technology, Altered States offered something stranger, the fear that evolution, memory, and madness might still be hiding inside the body. That is why it still works. It does not just ask what science can discover. It asks what happens if science discovers something we were never meant to wake up. Contamination, 1980. The eggs do not hatch. They explode people from the inside. That one sentence tells you exactly why contamination became one of the most notorious sci-fi horror shocks of 1980. Made in Italy during the era when filmmakers were racing to cash in on the success of Alien, this film took one idea and pushed it straight into nightmare territory. Mysterious green alien eggs arrive on Earth, and when they burst, human bodies erupt in graphic, stomach-turning violence. It was messy, outrageous, and impossible to ignore. In Britain, contamination became caught in the video nasty panic, where authorities treated certain horror tapes as dangerous objects rather than simple entertainment. The film's gore, especially its explosive body effects, made it an easy target. But beneath the shock value, there is a fascinating Cold War anxiety running through it. Contamination, infection, hidden invasion, and the fear that something foreign has already entered the system. Today, viewers can finally watch it as both a wild exploitation film and a time capsule of censorship paranoia. It may not be elegant, but it has the one thing many safe movies lack, a reckless, forbidden energy that makes every scene feel like it might go too far. Escape from New York, 1981.
Gotham'dan teyit aldık. Tehlike sınırına yakın noktada ateş açıldı. Sudakilerin ikisi öldü.
The future looked so rotten in this movie that it felt less like entertainment and more like a warning smuggled out of a collapsing society. Escape from New York gave audiences one of the grimiest visions of tomorrow. Manhattan has become a giant prison, the government has lost control, and one hard-eyed criminal named Snake Plissken is sent into the ruins to rescue the president. John Carpenter did not build a shiny sci-fi world. He built a nightmare made of smoke, broken streets, fear, and distrust. The film's violence, bleak tone, and anti-authority attitude made it feel dangerous in a decade still obsessed with law, order, and national image. It was not banned in the same famous way as some video nasties, but it was definitely the kind of gritty dystopian material that faced scrutiny and ratings pressure in certain markets. What makes it powerful now is how prophetic it feels. Crime panic, political collapse, militarized control, and urban decay all sit under the surface like a loaded weapon. Escape from New York did not simply imagine the future, it accused the present, and that is why Snake Plissken still feels like the coolest warning sign 80s sci-fi ever created. Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, 1982. Even Star Trek, the franchise built on hope, exploration, and human progress, once had scenes considered too intense for younger viewers. Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, is often remembered as one of the greatest science fiction sequels ever made, but its darker edge shocked people who expected clean space adventure. This was not just a story about starships and strategy. It was about revenge, aging, sacrifice, obsession, and the terrifying cost of old mistakes returning with a vengeance. The scene that caused the most concern involved the infamous SETI eels, creatures placed inside victims' ears to control their minds. For a franchise associated with optimistic television adventure, that moment felt almost like body horror. In the UK, some material was removed from the original cinema release before fuller versions became more widely available later. That history makes The Wrath of Khan even more fascinating. It proved that mainstream sci-fi could be mature, frightening, and emotionally devastating without losing its sense of grandeur. The film still works because it understands that the scariest thing in space is not always an alien monster. Sometimes it is an old enemy who knows exactly where your deepest wounds are. Extro, 1982. Some alien movies want to impress you with spaceships. Extra wants to make you wonder if you should be watching it at all. This British sci-fi horror film became infamous because it did not treat alien contact as wonder, adventure, or mystery. It treated it as violation, trauma, and domestic nightmare. The story begins with a father mysteriously abducted, then returning in a form that feels deeply wrong, bringing alien influence into a normal family home. But Extro's reputation comes from its shocking imagery, disturbing birth-like sequences, strange psychic powers, unnatural transformations, and moments that feel designed to unsettle rather than entertain. During the UK video panic, it became associated with the kind of titles authorities feared could corrupt viewers, even though part of its power comes from how surreal and emotionally broken it feels. The film is strange, uneven, and sometimes almost dreamlike, but that is exactly why it survived as a cult object. It does not behave like a normal sci-fi film. It feels like a nightmare someone tried to explain after waking up too fast. Extro may not be polished, but it is unforgettable. And sometimes unforgettable is more valuable than perfect. Videodrome, 1983. Before the internet swallowed reality, Videodrome already knew the screen was going to change the human body, the human mind, and maybe even the human soul. Released in 1983, David Cronenberg's film was far too disturbing to be treated as ordinary science fiction. It follows a television executive who discovers a mysterious broadcast filled with violence, torture, and hallucination, only to realize the signal may be physically reshaping him. The genius of Videodrome is that it turns media addiction into body horror. Technology does not just influence people here. It enters them, mutates them, and rewrites their desires. The film faced censorship and heavily cut versions in different markets because its violent imagery, sexual unease, and grotesque practical effects pushed beyond what many censors were ready to accept. But time has been very kind to it. Today, Videodrome feels less like an extreme cult film and more like a prophecy about screens, obsession, algorithmic control, and the way entertainment can quietly become a weapon. It is cold, strange, and hypnotic in a way that still feels dangerous. The final punch is simple. Cronenberg was not exaggerating. He may have been early. The Terminator, 1984. This is not just a killer robot movie. It is a nightmare about the future hunting you before you even understand why you matter. The Terminator arrived like a low-budget machine built out of paranoia, neon, gunmetal, and bad dreams. James Cameron took a simple chase story and turned it into one of the most relentless sci-fi thrillers of the decade. Arnold Schwarzenegger's machine does not negotiate, hesitate, or feel. He simply keeps coming, which made the violence feel cold and mechanical rather than heroic. At the time, the film's brutality, nightclub slaughter, police station attack, and grim atmosphere pushed it closer to horror than standard sci-fi adventure. That is why it carried a harder edge in many markets and became part of the decade's larger debate over screen violence. But the real shock is how small and human the film feels beneath the action. Sarah Connor is not a superhero. She is an ordinary woman being crushed by a future she never asked for. The Terminator still works because it makes technology feel personal. The machine is terrifying, but the bigger fear is even darker. Maybe the future has already chosen its victims. The Toxic Avenger, 1984.
Bueno, solo un músculo importante. Sí.
The superhero boom did not begin with clean capes and polished universes. Sometimes it crawled out of toxic waste with a mop in its hand. The Toxic Avenger, released in 1984, is one of the strangest cult mutations of the decade. Part sci-fi monster movie, part superhero origin story, part disgusting social satire, and part outrageous midnight movie dare. The story follows a bullied janitor who falls into toxic chemicals and becomes a deformed, crime-fighting vigilante. On paper, that sounds almost comic book simple. On screen, it becomes something much wilder, filled with grotesque effects, cruel villains, absurd comedy, and violence so exaggerated that censors could barely decide whether to laugh or cut it apart. In several versions and markets, scenes were trimmed because the film gleefully crossed lines most mainstream superhero films would never touch, but that is also the reason it survived. The Toxic Avenger feels like a rebellion against polite entertainment. It turns pollution, bullying, corruption, and social ugliness into a messy revenge fantasy where the monster becomes the moral center of the story. It is tasteless, chaotic, and completely unashamed. And in a world full of sanitized heroes, that dirty, radioactive honesty still gives it a strange kind of power. The Fly, 1986.
The feeling you don't get out much.
You can tell that.
Yeah.
The scariest monster in this film is not the Fly. It is the slow, humiliating collapse of a human being who can feel himself disappearing. The Fly took a simple science experiment and transformed it into one of the most emotionally devastating body horror films ever made. Cronenberg's version follows Seth Brundle, a brilliant scientist whose teleportation machine accidentally fuses his DNA with a fly. But the horror does not arrive all at once. It creeps in through tiny changes, strange strength, odd habits, damaged skin, emotional instability, and the terrifying realization that the body has become a prison. The film pushed boundaries because its effects were not just shocking, they were intimate. Every stage of Brundle's transformation feels painful, disgusting, and tragic. Audiences were not simply watching a monster appear, they were watching a man rot into something he could no longer control. That made the film far more disturbing than a normal creature feature. It touched fears of illness, aging, obsession, and losing identity. The Fly remains powerful because it understands that great sci-fi horror is not about technology failing. It is about ambition succeeding in the worst possible way and leaving a human soul trapped inside the consequences. Aliens, 1986. Most sequels try to repeat the first movie. Aliens marched into the same nightmare and handed it heavier weapons. Aliens turned Ridley Scott's haunted house in space concept into a full-scale survival war, but it never lost the terror underneath the spectacle. Ellen Ripley returns decades after the original disaster, only to be pulled back toward the same alien species that destroyed her life. This time, the horror is bigger. A colony gone silent, Marines losing control, corridors crawling with movement, and a queen creature that turns motherhood into something monstrous. The film's intensity, creature violence, and relentless siege structure made it one of the harshest mainstream sci-fi experiences of the decade, earning strict age ratings in certain territories. But Aliens is not memorable simply because it is loud. It works because every explosion is tied to fear, trauma, and protection. Ripley is not fighting for glory. She is fighting because survival has finally given her someone worth saving. That emotional core makes the danger hit harder. Aliens proved that action sci-fi could be muscular, terrifying, and deeply human at the same time. Few sequels expand a universe this aggressively and still make the audience feel trapped in the dark. Predator, 1987. At first, Predator looks like a jungle action movie. Then the jungle starts hunting the soldiers back. Predator begins with everything audiences expected from an 80s military spectacle: muscle, guns, sweat, explosions, and a team of elite commandos who look almost impossible to defeat. Slowly strips that confidence away. One by one, these heavily armed men realize they are not the hunters. They are trophies. The alien creature watching them from the trees is not simply a monster. It is a technologically advanced warrior with rules, camouflage, heat vision, and a terrifying sense of sport. The film's graphic violence, skinned bodies, and brutal survival imagery made it one of the harder-edged sci-fi action films of the decade, and its intensity helped define the muscular cinema of the era. But what makes Predator last is the reversal. The film takes the strongest man in the room, Arnold Schwarzenegger's Dutch, and reduces him to mud, fear, instinct, and silence. By the final act, all the guns and bravado are gone. What remains is primal survival. Predator is brilliant because it exposes the fantasy of unstoppable men, then sends something even more unstoppable to test it. Society, 1989. This is the kind of movie that starts like a rich family mystery and ends like someone peeled the skin off high society. Society is one of the strangest late 80s sci-fi horror films because its real monster is not from outer space or a laboratory. It is privilege itself. The story follows a teenager who suspects that his wealthy family and their elite social circle are hiding something unnatural beneath their polished smiles. At first, the film plays like a paranoid teen thriller, full of strange behavior, family secrets, and that awful feeling of not belonging in your own home. Then the final act arrives and turns the entire movie into a grotesque social nightmare. The practical effects became infamous because they transformed class anxiety into literal body horror, creating images so outrageous and disturbing that the film struggled with censorship and delayed release in some places. But Society is not shocking just for the sake of shock. Its brilliance is that the disgusting imagery has a point. It says the rich do not merely exploit the lower classes, they consume them, absorb them, and laugh while doing it. That is why the film feels sharper now than ever. Society may look absurd on the surface, but underneath the slime, it is one of the most vicious class satires 80s sci-fi ever produced. Blade Runner, 1982.
Yes! Now that's a vice.
Some movies predict the future with machines. Blade Runner predicted the loneliness, advertising, rain, and spiritual emptiness that would come with it, not fully understood when it first reached audiences. Instead of fast laser battles and simple heroes, it gave viewers a slow, haunted, neo-noir world where artificial humans called replicants were hunted through a decaying Los Angeles. The film's original theatrical version was shaped by studio pressure, including voiceover narration and an ending many felt softened the darker meaning of the story. Over the years, different cuts appeared, and the later final cut allowed the film to feel more like the strange, melancholy vision it was always meant to be. That history matters because Blade Runner is a movie about identity, control, and who gets to decide what a life is worth. Its violence is sharp, but its emotional damage is deeper. The replicants are treated like machines, yet they fear death, crave memory, and search for meaning more desperately than the humans around them. That is why the film became a classic slowly, almost like a secret passed between viewers. Blade Runner is not just watchable now, it feels essential because its biggest question still hurts. If a machine can feel, maybe the real test is whether humans still can. The Thing, 1982. The monster in The Thing does not simply attack people, it steals their faces, copies their voices, and turns trust into a death sentence. Nightmare was too grim, too grotesque, and too suspicious for many viewers at the time. Set in an isolated Antarctic research station, the film follows a group of men who discover an alien organism capable of imitating any living creature perfectly. That idea alone is terrifying, but Carpenter and effects genius Rob Bottin made it unforgettable by showing transformation as a violent, impossible eruption of flesh, bone, teeth, and screaming biology. Critics in the early 80s were often harsh, partly because the film arrived in the shadow of more hopeful alien stories. But The Thing offered no comfort, no friendly visitor, no glowing spaceship, no emotional rescue, just paranoia, blood tests, locked rooms, and the awful possibility that the person beside you is no longer human. The intensity of its effects and its bleak tone made it a target for censorship concerns, and later helped secure its cult reputation. Today, it stands as one of the greatest sci-fi horror films ever made because it understands fear on a primal level. The alien is terrifying, but the real horror is simpler. Once trust dies, everyone becomes a monster. RoboCop, 1987.
Cinayete teşebbüs mü? O hiç kimseyi öldürmedi. Bu müvekkilimin kanuni hakları...
RoboCop was not cut because it was just violent. It was cut because its violence exposed the ugliest joke hiding inside corporate America. Released in 1987, cyberpunk classic looked like a futuristic action movie, but underneath the armor was one of the sharpest satires of the decade. The story follows police officer Alex Murphy, who is brutally killed and rebuilt by a powerful corporation as a robotic law enforcement product. The original version was so intense that it received an X rating before edits were made to secure a more commercial release. That censorship history is important because the film's extreme violence was never random. It was exaggerated, ugly, and almost absurd on purpose, designed to make the audience feel how cheap human life had become in a world ruled by profit, privatized policing, and media spectacle. Murphy's transformation into RoboCop is thrilling, but also deeply sad. A murdered man is turned into property, then slowly fights to recover the memories, pain, and identity the corporation tried to erase. That emotional tragedy gives the film its lasting power. RoboCop remains watchable not because it is a cool action machine, but because it predicted a future where companies sell control as safety, and people applaud until they realize they are the product. The wildest part about these movies is that the same films once treated like dangerous contraband are now called masterpieces of sci-fi cinema. So which one still shocked you the most today? And which banned 80s sci-fi nightmare did we leave off the list? Drop your picks in the comments, hit like if you want more forgotten cult classics, and subscribe, because some of cinema's strangest stories are still hidden in the dark.